23 seconds. That's how long it took a six-man French Special Forces team to neutralize an entire compound in the Adrar Desafogus Mountains of northern Mali. 23 seconds from the moment boots hit sand to the final hostile down. Inside, they found 14 armed militants. 12 were dead. 2 were flex-cuffed and extracted before the echo of the breach charges stopped ringing. American intelligence analysts monitoring the operation from a surveillance aircraft at 12,000 feet couldn't comprehend what their thermal imaging had just recorded. A Pentagon liaison officer embedded with French Special Operations Command in Paris sent an encrypted message back to JSOC headquarters at Fort Bragg that contained 4 words which would trigger the most comprehensive foreign military assessment the United States had conducted since studying Soviet Spetsnaz doctrine during the Cold War. How are they invisible? The question wasn't rhetorical. Between 2013 and 2014, French special forces operating across the Sahel region of Africa were achieving results that defied every operational model in the American playbook. Small teams, sometimes as few as 4 operators, were conducting direct action raids in hostile territory hundreds of kilometers from any support base, extracting high-value targets that coalition intelligence had been tracking for months, and disappearing back into the desert before enemy reinforcements could respond. The mission success rate exceeded 90%. Casualty rates among French operators were almost non-existent, and the Pentagon had absolutely no idea how they were doing it. This wasn't a story about superior technology. The French weren't using experimental aircraft or classified weapon systems. They were driving modified Toyota Land Cruisers and carrying the same rifles that had been in service since the 1990s. This wasn't about overwhelming force. American Special Operations could put 40 Delta operators on a target with helicopter gunship support, and Reaper drones providing overwatch. The French were sending 6 guys in 2 trucks. What the Americans were witnessing was something far more difficult to quantify and impossible to purchase. They were watching the end product of a selection and training system that had been producing a specific type of operator for over 60 years, an operator who could function as a complete tactical unit alone, who could navigate by stars across 200 kilometers of featureless desert, who could survive for weeks on local food and water sources that would hospitalize most Western soldiers, and who had internalized close-quarters combat to the point where room clearance wasn't a procedure, it was a reflex. The French Foreign Legion's 1st Parachute Regiment, known as Premier REP, and the Naval Commandos, specifically Commando Hubert, had been operating in Africa longer than most American special operators had been alive. They'd fought in Chad, in Djibouti, in the Central African Republic, in Côte d'Ivoire. They'd conducted operations in environments so austere that the concept of logistics support meant carrying an extra magazine, and they'd been doing it continuously without pause through decades when American special forces were focused on the Balkans, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The raid that triggered the Pentagon inquiry occurred in March 2013, approximately 2 months after France launched Operation Serval to prevent Islamist militants from overrunning the Malian capital of Bamako. French forces had pushed north into the Sahara, pursuing retreating militant groups affiliated with al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb into the Adrar des Ifoghas, a mountain range near the Algerian border that offered thousands of caves, ravines, and hidden valleys perfect for insurgent sanctuary. Intelligence had identified a compound being used by a high-value target, a logistics coordinator responsible for moving weapons and explosives across the region. The compound sat in a valley accessible only by a single dirt track, surrounded by elevated positions that provided clear observation of any approaching force. A conventional assault would require significant preparation, likely helicopter insertion to avoid the approach route, and substantial fire support to suppress the surrounding high ground. The French sent 6 operators from Commando Hubert in 2 vehicles. They approached at night, navigating without headlights across terrain that would be challenging in daylight. They bypassed the main track entirely, driving cross-country through a route that shouldn't have been passable for vehicles, using night vision that was a generation behind what American special operations carried. They positioned both vehicles within 50 meters of the compound perimeter without being detected by sentries who were actively scanning the valley approaches with thermal optics. Then they hit the compound with a speed and violence that appeared to the Americans watching from above almost supernatural. The breach was simultaneous on 3 entry points. The operators moved through the compound's interior with no apparent communication, each man clearing his designated sector as if following a choreographed sequence they'd rehearsed 1,000 times. Which they had. Engagements were resolved with aimed fire at ranges sometimes less than 3 meters. Not a single round missed its intended target. The distinction between hostile and non-hostile was made instantaneously. 2 women and a child in one of the rear rooms were bypassed without hesitation. The high-value target, attempting to escape through a concealed tunnel exit, was intercepted by an operator who had anticipated the route and positioned himself at the egress point before the assault even began. Total time from first shot to fin. All room clear, 23 seconds. The French extracted with their prisoners, drove back across the same impossible terrain, and were 40 kilometers away before Malian military forces even received notification that an operation had occurred. The Pentagon's confusion was understandable. American Special Operations Doctrine emphasized technology, speed, and overwhelming capability. Helicopter insertion minimized exposure. Drone coverage provided complete situational awareness. Communication systems allowed real-time coordination with command elements. The French had approached in vehicles that could be heard from a kilometer away, had no overhead surveillance of their own, and appeared to communicate primarily through hand signals and pre-mission planning so thorough that verbal orders during the assault were almost unnecessary. What the Americans were struggling to understand was a fundamentally different operational philosophy, one that didn't rely on technology to solve problems that training could address, one that assumed operators would be isolated, unsupported, and forced to rely entirely on their own capabilities, one that had been shaped by 60 years of colonial and post-colonial operations in environments where calling for backup meant waiting 3 days for a resupply convoy that might not arrive. The assessment request that landed on desks at the Pentagon wasn't motivated by academic curiosity. By mid-2013, American Special Operations Forces were stretched across multiple theaters. Syria was becoming a concern. Ukraine was on the horizon. The ability to conduct high-tempo operations with minimal footprint and minimal support infrastructure wasn't just interesting, it was operationally critical. If the French had figured out how to do this at scale, the Pentagon needed to know how. The answer they found wasn't in equipment catalogs or training manuals, it was in a forest. Specifically, a 14,000-hectare training area in the Sologne region of central France, 180 kilometers south of Paris. The facility doesn't appear on civilian maps. Satellite imagery shows dense woodland, a few clearings, and what appears to be abandoned farm buildings. What the satellites don't show is the most sophisticated close quarters, battle training infrastructure in Europe, a mock urban environment that's been continuously expanded since 1976, and a selection course that makes candidates navigate 100 kilometers through swampland carrying 40 kilograms while being actively hunted by instructors with orders to make capture as unpleasant as possible. The facility is called the Centre National d'Entraînement Commando. It's where French Special Operations Forces have been forged since the Algerian War ended, and France realized it needed a different kind of soldier for a different kind of conflict. American observers who were eventually granted access, a concession that required negotiations at the defense minister level, reported something that initially seemed impossible. The French were producing operators of comparable capability to American Tier 1 units while spending approximately 1/7 the budget per candidate and using training facilities that looked, by American standards, decades out of date. The Killing House equivalent, a structure the French called the Maison de Tir, was built in 1981. It's constructed from reinforced concrete and reconfigured manually between training evolutions using plywood walls that instructors move by hand. There are no electronic target systems, no computer-controlled pop-up threats, no sophisticated after-action review technology that tracks every round fired and generates performance metrics. Instead, there are instructors, the same instructors who have been running the facility for 15, sometimes 20 years, who know every possible configuration of every room, who can tell from the sound of footsteps whether an operator has committed to his entry or is hesitating, who will stop a drill mid-execution if they observe a single procedural deviation and make the team restart from the beginning. One American observer, a Delta Force sergeant major with 18 years of experience, described the French approach in a trip report that was later circulated within the special operations community. They don't train to standard, they train to instinct. The difference is that a standard can be met and checked off. An instinct has to be built through repetition so intensive that the conscious mind stops being involved in the decision loop. The French selection process reflects this philosophy with brutal clarity. Candidates for Commando Marine, the Naval Special Forces unit that provided the operators for that Mali compound raid, face a preliminary course that lasts 3 weeks. Not 3 weeks of progressive training building toward a final test. 3 weeks of continuous testing where every single day is an elimination event. Day 1 begins with a swimming assessment in the Bay of Douarnenez off the Brittany coast. The water temperature in January, when most selection courses begin, averages 9 degrees Celsius. Candidates swim 500 meters in combat uniform and boots. Then they tread water for 20 minutes. Then they swim another 500 meters. The instructors are in boats, warm boats. They're watching for technique, but more importantly, they're watching for the moment when a candidate's body language reveals he's negotiating with himself about whether to continue. That negotiation means failure, not because the candidate quit, but because he considered it. By day 3, the original class of typically 80 to 100 candidates has usually dropped to about 60. By day 7, it's 40. By day 21, between 12 and 18 remain. These survivors then progress to the actual training course, which lasts an additional 7 months. But here's what separated the French system from virtually every other special operations pipeline the American observers examined. The instructors weren't looking for physical specimens. They were looking for men who had already decided that failure was not a negotiable outcome. A former Commando Marine instructor explained the distinction to a French journalist in terms that revealed the entire philosophy. We can teach a man to shoot. We can teach him to navigate. We can teach him to plan an operation. We cannot teach him to continue when every part of his body and mind is telling him to stop. That quality either exists or it doesn't. Our job is to discover who has it. This created operators who approached problems differently. When American special operations encountered an obstacle, the institutional response was often to apply more resources, more surveillance, more fire support, more sophisticated equipment. When French special operations encountered the same obstacle, the response was to reduce the footprint and increase the individual capability of the men on the ground. The Mali operation demonstrated this at the tactical level, but the philosophy extended to operational planning. French special operations commanders in Africa, operating from a headquarters in N'Djamena, Chad, were running networks across 6 countries with a total in-country strength that never exceeded 200 personnel. This included operators, intelligence staff, logistics personnel, and command elements. By comparison, American special operations maintained a larger force in just Afghanistan, supported by an intelligence and logistics infrastructure that employed thousands. The question the Pentagon assessment was really asking wasn't how the French cleared rooms quickly. It was how they sustained operations across an entire region with resources that wouldn't support American operations in a single province. The answer involved rethinking assumptions about what special operations forces actually needed. The French operated from the premise that if your operators were good enough, you didn't need the same level of supporting infrastructure. If your intelligence personnel could develop human sources instead of relying on technical collection, you didn't need the same satellite coverage. If your planning cycle assumed operations would be executed with whatever resources were immediately available, you didn't need the same logistics tail. This wasn't about making do with less. It was about building a force where less was sufficient because the individual capability was so high that supporting infrastructure became less critical. An American special operations officer who spent 6 months embedded with French forces in Chad described the operational difference in his after-action report. They don't wait for the perfect intelligence picture. They don't wait for optimal conditions. They develop enough information to understand the target, then they go. The assumption is that the assault team will solve whatever problems emerge during execution because that's what the selection and training process has prepared them to do. This created a tempo that looked reckless by American standards but produced results that couldn't be argued with. Over a 2-year period from 2013 to 2015, French special operations in the Sahel region conducted an estimated 400 direct action raids with a force that averaged fewer than 60 operators in theater at any given time. The mathematics were startling. That's nearly 7 operations per operator per year, not counting reconnaissance missions, training deployments, and other taskings. The attrition rate told another story. Of those 400 operations, French forces sustained fewer than 15 casualties, killed or wounded. The target networks they dismantled were responsible for destabilizing 3 countries and threatening to collapse 2 more. A senior French military official speaking to a closed-door NATO conference in Brussels put the comparison in terms that made American planners visibly uncomfortable. You spend billions to achieve what we accomplish with millions. The difference is not in the technology. It is in the 40 kilometers a man carries on his back in the Pyrenees before we will even consider letting him attempt selection. The Mali hostage rescue became a reference point for something larger than a single operation. It demonstrated that the French model, built on individual capability rather than technological superiority, could produce results in Africa that paralleled what the British had achieved in Iraq. Different terrain, different enemy, different tactical challenges, but the same underlying principle. Quality defeats quantity when quality is defined correctly. But there was a cost the French paid that rarely appeared in operational assessments. The Commando Marine selection course had a death rate, not theoretical risk, actual deaths. Since 1980, at least 6 candidates had died during the mountain phase alone from hypothermia, falls, and cardiac events brought on by extreme exertion at altitude. The regiment's official position was that these deaths, while tragic, were inherent to a selection process designed to identify men capable of surviving conditions that would kill most humans. A former French special operations surgeon speaking anonymously to a military journal articulated the institutional calculation with brutal honesty. We are selecting for men who can operate in environments where rescue is impossible and failure means death. The selection must replicate that reality. If we make it safe, we are no longer testing what we need to test. This created an ethical tension that American special operations had largely avoided through more controlled selection environments. Delta Force's operator training course was extraordinarily difficult and carried significant injury risk, but it was designed with safety protocols that prevented deaths during the selection phase itself. The French accepted mortality during selection as proof the system was testing the right variables. Whether this represented superior commitment or institutional recklessness became a matter of perspective that divided Western special operations communities. What couldn't be divided was the operational record. By 2015, French special operations had conducted more combat raids per capita than any other Western military force since the Rhodesian Special Air Service in the 1970s. They had done this with equipment that was often a generation behind American equivalents, operating in countries where the supporting infrastructure ranged from minimal to non-existent, sustained by budgets that represented a fraction of what the Pentagon allocated to comparable units. The strategic implications extended beyond tactical success rates. France was maintaining influence across former colonial territories in Africa, with a special operations footprint that cost less annually than a single American forward operating base in Afghanistan. They were training partner forces, disrupting terrorist networks, and conducting direct action against high-value targets using a model that didn't require the massive logistics infrastructure American operations depended upon. A classified RAND Corporation study completed in 2016 examined the comparative cost-effectiveness of French versus American special operations in Africa. The findings, portions of which were later leaked to defense journalists, concluded that French forces were achieving similar operational effects at approximately 1/15 the cost per operator deployed. The study attributed this primarily to reduced logistics requirements and smaller support footprints enabled by higher individual operator capability. The Pentagon's response was telling. Rather than attempting to replicate the French model, American special operations doubled down on technological advantage. Investment flowed into advanced surveillance systems, armed drones, and artificial intelligence-enabled targeting platforms. The assumption was that American forces could achieve the same effects the French were producing through individual capability by instead leveraging superior technology and intelligence systems. This assumption would be tested in the chaos of Syria and Iraq between 2014 and 2019, where both French and American special operations fought ISIS simultaneously, often in adjacent operational areas. The results provided a natural experiment in competing philosophies. French operators working with Kurdish forces in northeastern Syria operated from austere compounds with minimal amenities, often sleeping in the same conditions as their partner forces. They patrolled on foot or in unarmored vehicles, relying on situational awareness and relationships with local populations for security. Their targeting cycle ran primarily on human intelligence developed through direct engagement with tribal leaders, defectors, and local informants. American special operations in the same region operated from fortified bases with extensive force protection, communicated through encrypted satellite systems, and moved primarily by helicopter. Their targeting relied heavily on signals intelligence, drone surveillance, and technical collection platforms. The support infrastructure required to sustain this approach included hundreds of personnel for every dozen operators actually conducting missions. Both approaches worked, but the mathematics were radically different. A French Special Operations Task Force of approximately 50 operators, supported by perhaps 30 additional intelligence and logistics personnel, was conducting operations across an area the size of Belgium. An equivalent American Special Operations Task Force required over 300 personnel to cover a similar area once all supporting elements were included. The question wasn't which force was more effective in absolute terms. Both were achieving their objectives. The question was what happened when resources became constrained, when political will wavered, when the massive infrastructure required to support the American model became unsustainable. The French had built a system that assumed constraint from the beginning. Limited budgets, limited personnel, limited political patience for extended deployments. Their selection and training produced operators who could function effectively under those constraints because they had been tested under worse during the 40-kilometer march through the Pyrenees. The British had refined a parallel system through decades of operations where resources were always scarce and political support was always conditional. The Brecon beacons and the Killing House produced operators who didn't need perfect intelligence or overwhelming support because they had learned to operate when both were absent. These weren't just different training programs. They were different philosophies about what made military force effective. The American model, built on the assumption that resources would always be available and technology would always provide advantage, produced forces of extraordinary capability when those assumptions held. But the assumptions didn't always hold. The French model, built on the assumption that resources would never be sufficient and technology would often fail, produced forces capable of operating when assumptions collapsed. Which philosophy proved more valuable depended entirely on what future conflicts would look like. What both the Mali operation and Task Force Black demonstrated was that individual capability, developed through selection processes brutal enough to eliminate everyone lacking the essential qualities, remained the irreplaceable foundation of special operations effectiveness. Technology could enhance but not replace. Numbers could multiply but not substitute. The man walking through the door into an unknown room filled with armed enemies relied ultimately on training so deeply embedded it had become instinct. That transformation from conscious thought to automatic response required years to develop and couldn't be purchased, no matter the budget. 40 kilometers through mountains or 64 kilometers across the Brecon beacons weren't just physical tests. They were the forge where that instinct was created in men capable of bearing it. The Pentagon's assessment of French special operations reached a conclusion that made defense planners deeply uncomfortable. The gap wasn't technological. It wasn't doctrinal. It was human. The French had spent 6 decades building a system that identified and forged individuals capable of extraordinary performance under conditions where support didn't exist, and failure meant death. That system couldn't be replicated with budget increases or equipment upgrades. It required institutional patience measured in generations and acceptance of costs most Western militaries were unwilling to pay. 23 seconds in Mali, 17 seconds in Baghdad. The numbers told the same story. When you stripped away technology, logistics, and overwhelming force, what remained was the individual operator moving through that doorway. Everything else was infrastructure built to get him there. The French and British had discovered that if you made the individual capable enough, you needed far less infrastructure. The Americans had built the world's most sophisticated military machine on the opposite premise. Neither was wrong. But only one model worked when the infrastructure disappeared. 6 men in 2 trucks, crossing impossible terrain in darkness, clearing a compound in less time than it takes to read this sentence. That's not tactics. That's what happens when selection discovers the right men and training transforms them into something most humans can't become. The warning the Pentagon received wasn't about French capabilities. It was about American assumptions, and some assumptions don't survive contact with reality.